with Sasquatch. It's like people say, well, what do you do once it's proven? I said, that's when it starts. That's when it really begins. I mean, because it's not suddenly going to become easy to find or let alone observe and study a Sasquatch. I mean, you reflect back on the pioneering efforts of Jane Goodall. It took Jane months and months and months of sitting on that hillside. And she was on one little flank of a short mountain range, completely penned in by cultivated land, no place for these chimps to go. And yet it took her months and months even to start catching glimpses of it, let alone having any meaningful observation. And then it was, a year or more before she was, they were habituated to the point that she could actually watch. And this is a social group of gregarious, noisy chimpanzees, not a single isolated, solitary Sasquatch. There are more, but they are solitary in their behavior by all accounts, and probably dispersed through a large habitat, maybe 1,000 square miles. So you can't sit in one place and wait for them unless you have serendipity in your pocket. It's just that it seemed that my life's course ended up at another point of nexus there at an opportune time when I was a professional with specialties and expertise in an area that made me a prime candidate for someone to evaluate or to carry on the analysis of evidence relating to the very physical aspect of this phenomenon, the anatomical morphological adaptations of a bipedal primate. And so when I have young people, and I should add, and the consequences of that collision, because right like that yes. was the consequences were not always positive. I mean, there's been a lot of good things that have come of that, but it also nearly cost me my job. It has created such polarization of attitudes towards me and my academic research amongst my own colleagues and here in the department and abroad across the discipline, that people often ask me, if you had to do it over again, would you? And I pause for a minute and reconsider it. And no, I wouldn't do it differently. I mean, I think because the positives on the other side of all those negatives were just amazing. I mean, the opportunities I've had to travel and to investigate and to spend time in the field and have firsthand experiences are just priceless. What really drew my attention to it was the remarkable pressure ridge that was evident in one of the casts from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And this is why it's all the more impressive, because it's not just a weird artifact or something. You can actually see the midfoot flexibility across the transverse tarsal. Well, what I infer as the transverse tarsal joint. It's the only joint that really makes sense for this kind of mobility to exist. But the point is, you can see the dynamic externally on the foot of the subject in the film, leaving those footprints. And so, but then, I mean, and it's not just in isolation, but my point was that there are examples that predate even that. I mean, for example, there's this picture of the bespectacled, crew cut construction worker, Jerry Crew, holding the first footprint cast that was documented in North America or in the United States. There presumably was one that was cast up in BC a decade earlier, but it didn't survive. It didn't. Is no longer in existence. But the point is, the widely disseminated picture of this footprint cast was taken by a newspaper photographer back in the days. Remember those? You probably don't. Remember those blue flash bulbs?
Yes.
The big bellows. It probably was a camera like that, and those flashes were so stark that it makes everything look flat. You can see the real strong black shadow against the wall in the back. But he's holding this cast, and so the cast looks absolutely flat as a board, right?
Mm-hmm.
The carved wooden foot. Well, I had the privilege of examining the original cast. It's now in the possession of Jerry Crew's son, John, who lived in Portland. Cliff Barrickman had also seen it and examined it. He was nice enough to actually let me, upon request. He had it in a shadow box, wired into a shadow box along with the newspaper clipping and so forth. He let me carefully unwire it and take it out, set it on the tabletop so I could photograph it from all different angles. Didn't have a 3D scanner at that time. But the thing was, coming down to the side and looking, it's not flat as a board. It has a pressure ridge, just like the titmus cat, not quite as deep, but it has in exactly the same spot and orientation, position and orientation on the anatomy lines up perfectly. Who'd have guessed? Well, and then on top of that, this was what really sealed the deal for me. Was I had the chance to go to China, and the Chinese have the Yeren, the wild man, and there are reports across Asia through China, and I mean there are actually footprint record that spans all the way across Southeastern Asia and up skirting the Himalayas and button hooking around the various mountain ranges around Mongolia, all the way over to the Caucasus Mountains, ending there before you get to Europe. And but I had a chance to go over to China. They have reports of Sasquatch-like creatures that are extremely similar in description. And all these footprints have a non-divergent big toe. They look just like a Sasquatch, approximately the same average size, in excess of 14, 15, 16 inches. This gentleman that we interviewed, Mr. Yuan, who had been a game warden, or a park ranger, better term, not a game warden, a park ranger, in the Shenanjia Reserve in Hubei Province, which has a rich history of reports. Actually, one of the reasons that the reserve was actually created there. And he had an experience where he had an encounter, saw one of these things at fairly close proximity, and was able to track it, found where it had stopped for a drink at a spring, and it apparently had squatted beside the spring in the muddy bank and had left some deeply impressed footprints. Well, as it squatted, you imagine when we squat down, we're up on the balls of our feet because we have arched feet.
Mm-hmm.
This creature with a transverse tarsal joint that's much more flexible, when it squats, its heel would come up, but the entire forefoot is in contact, was differentially impressed, and made a pressure ridge pushing some of the material to kind of sank in, push some of the material back, just like in the titmus with the walking print at the Patterson-Gimlin film site. Well, they wouldn't let me see the cast. He retrieved some casting material and came back, because these were so clear, and made a right and left plaster cast. Well, they wouldn't let me see them because they wanted to have the interview set up, the cameras rolling to capture my initial reaction to this. As leading up to this, as we're driving out to the location that they were going to set up at this nice park setting, Mr. Yuan has his little travel suitcase under his arm. And I had reached in my satchel and I'd brought some reprints of this ichnotaxonomy of the Sasquatch footprints paper, and he couldn't read the English, but it was illustrated with photographs of plaster casts and so forth, including this beautiful 3D scan of the titmus cast presented in a sequence of 3 angles, and with that very distinctive pressure ridge. He saw that, man, he sat up and he grabs my coat and he's pulling on the sleeve and he's thumping on the paper, nodding, big eyes. I say, okay. And we get there, and sure enough, they get set up and they turn us loose, and he opens up a suitcase and out comes the toweling. Out come these 2 footprint casts, the right and the left, and they are dead ringers.
Wow.
For the Patterson-Gimlin film site, the titmus cast with the very distinctive pressure ridge even more pronounced, because it had really, squatted, and that forefoot had really, the weight's all on that forefoot as it in that moist soil. It was a little bit broader, maybe a half-inch broader, but right there at about 15 inches in length, pressure ridge in exactly the same spot, same position, same orientation. It has when I say orientation, there's a slight cant. It's not perfectly transverse, because the talonavicular and the calcaneocuboid joints that make up the transverse tarsal joint, compound joint, they're slightly offset with the calcaneocuboid joint, a little more distally located. And so it throws the ridge, the axis of the ridge, at a slight angle, canted upward and outward on the outside, towards the outside of the foot. Subtle detail, but it's there. I mean, it's there consistently. And it was even more, since it was more pronounced, you could see this kind of a double bowed or bulge to the forefoot, to the proximal edge of the forefoot, that marked the position of those 2 joints, basically, with a differential pressure behind. And so looking at that, I looked back at the titmus, and yeah, sure enough, it's just more subtle. Hadn't really drawn attention to it, but there it was. And I've got other example after example after example that show the pressure ridge and all those features consistent. Now, who, like you said, what black ops, what organization is instructing these people not only to do this so remarkably consistently, but in such a way that it would correlate with the skeletal anatomy and our as yet unknown understanding or appreciation of the transverse tarsal joint flexibility in the early hominin foot. I mean,
it's almost impossible, because what year was the Patterson-Gimlin film?
1967, yeah. But I hadn't drawn attention to this feature and published on it until 1999.
Wow.
Right. So you would have been a really, really detailed oriented person back in the 60s if they. I can understand renting a costume and walking, but to know the detail of the foot of a primate and have it, it's impossible.
And it wasn't to be had. Especially by a layman who had no firsthand experience. I mean, the foot has, and footprints have with the previous couple of generations of academicians in this discipline, has grown in popularity, if you will. I mean, the number of papers, the number of individuals who are focused. When I launched, there were only 2 or 3 or 4 people, really. I was in kind of that first wave. Well, I would say I was in maybe the second wave or third wave. But my immediate predecessor, I mean, you had to go back far, but they didn't have the fossil material. They didn't have the footprint record. These Laetoli tracks were found in the 70s. And see, this is the thing. At the time that they were described, the Laetoli hominid footprints, this is a site in East Africa that's attributed generally, although not with certainty, to Australopithecus afarensis, an early bipedal hominin, and dates to about little over 3 to 3.5 million years ago in volcanic ash So a phreatic eruption, ash like Mount St. Helens, laid a layer of ash was just raining down during one of the interludes. Animals were scurrying around and left footprints, which in this wet, gloppy ash that probably had the consistency, of loose kind of fluffy cement. And then it rained lightly, created a nice little patina through the chemical interaction with the carbonates and whatnot, silicates and so forth in the ash. And then another ash fall came down, filled it in. See, and it was just like a layer cake. And so that's what preserved it as these layers eroded away. Eventually, it exposed the layer that had the imprints, or sometimes even lost the contact layer and had underprints where it presses down into the strata below. But the point is, just to give your viewers a little image of that, there was a lot of controversy as to interpretation. I mean, they're not. It's kind of a gloppy mess that some were very clear, some there were overlapping where a second individual, there's even one person who suggested there was a third. I don't buy that, but I can clearly see the imprints of the two. One, and then, it's like when you go walking with someone through a snowfall, you just naturally place your steps into their footprints. They've already broken the trail for you. And so there's that superimposition. It's not always perfect. And so you can pick out, especially, the real distinctive feature is the big toe, and which kind of juts out a little to the side even. But, and the heel imprint. But anyway, the point is, when these were first described, first popularized and studied and so forth, no one drew any attention to the fact that there's a mid-tarsal pressure ridge. And so when after discovering this in the Sasquatch tract, I thought, well, maybe this is something that really distinguishes Sasquatch from these early hominids. And that way we can distinguish them. Because if these first hominins, as these people were saying, were walking essentially on arched feet from 3 to 7 million years ago forward, then Sasquatch clearly had to have diverged before the emergence of the arched foot. Probably evolved bipedalism absolutely independently, convergently, from a more ape-like ancestor like Gigantopithecus. Something like that. Well, then I started looking more closely and I thought, oh, wait a minute, that looks like pressure ridge. And here's another one. It looks like, and so there were multiple trackways or footprints in the trackway that had what looked like a pressure ridge. There were a pair of researchers who had done a reconstruction of the foot skeleton using kind of a mosaic approach. It was pretty good. There were some challenges because they borrowed specimens from even more advanced, like Homo habilis. But anyway, they had published a photograph, actually a stereo photograph of the footprint with their reconstructed skeleton superimposed to show kind of like a Cinderella experiment. Does the slipper fit or not? Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because when you look, guess what? Right in front of the pressure ridge is their reconstructed location of the transverse tarsal joint. Lined up perfectly. And I had this conversation with Tim White, who had done most of the archiving of this site. And his first reaction was, oh, well, people have dismissed that as just, maybe it's just excavation artifact. I says, well, no, look at this. I mean, you can see there are and the real kicker was he had some fiberglass replicas of several tracks that had never been published. And instead of just a simple ridge, the substrate was wet enough that it pumped up and then extruded, and there was an extrusion front that had a rounded lip like you would get from, squeezing mud, not a fracture from a hammer and chisel. And it's in exactly the same place as the other artifacts. I said, you mean to tell? And then the other explanation was, well, the others have suggested that it was, subterranean termites that burrow like moles, kind of. They make this kind of molehill as they're working away, migrating out to start new colonies, and they just burrowed across so I showed him multiple images, and I says, you mean to tell me that multiple independent colonies of termites all transected the footprints, multiple footprints, at exactly the same spot in exactly the same orientation? I said, come on. This is
maybe the termites were attracted to the foot smell. Like maybe they were like,
right. Besides, even if that were the case, because, there were extrusion artifacts, what they do is when they hit the compacted part, they just go around. And there were some examples that might have been, rather than simply extrusion, were humped up termite burrows, but I don't think a strong case could be made for that anyway. But
people can find a reason to explain, to find a reason why to dispel anything. Like, hey, that's a worm colony, or like the sunlight hit this at a certain angle. Like, yeah, sure, it could.
They come up with something.
So the point simply being is, here's a feature that further confirms the notion that early bipedal hominins were walking, because now this has been further substantiated by the reconstruction of numerous foot skeletons of these various hominin species, and they all lack a fixed longitudinal arch. And as the arch actually emerged in a very piecemeal fashion because of the various joints that are involved, there was greater stability on the lateral side of the foot long before there was a fixed raised medial arch. And then it wasn't until we get up to the immediate ancestor of us and Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, that you get a low arch, and it's fixed. I mean, it is an arched foot, but humans have even amplified that to the extreme. I mean, before, I don't want to leave this yet and go to the other, but my point is simply that the Bigfoot evidence predated my analysis. My analysis predated the recognition, and now ultimately the acceptance that early hominins were walking on flat, flexible feet, and the few examples of footprints in fossilized footprints that we had suggest mid-tarsal pressure ridge. When something anticipates knowledge that has not been discovered yet, and it anticipates it by decades. I mean, this is the big argument that I make about the Patterson-Gimlin film itself. When you look at what's on the screen, there are all sorts of anatomies and combinations of features that were inexplicable in 1967, were contrary to conventional wisdom, which is why a lot of the scientists simply dismissed it out of hand. It can't